Back now to our top story. We know Michael Flynn failed to disclose meetings with Russia's ambassador to the U.S. and failed to acknowledge that they discussed sanctions. But there are so many other questions that investigators would like for him to answer. Now they have to decide, is his information worth the trade-off? We're joined by CNN legal analyst and criminal defense attorney Joey Jackson. Thanks so much for being with us. Let me ask you, what do you make of Flynn's request for immunity? And I make that question in the context of his own remarks, the president's remarks about immunity, which have been that you only ask for immunity if you're guilty of something.
Good to be with you, Jonathan. How times change. Yes, we remember him railing last year regarding the Hillary Clinton email investigation and saying, hey, you only get immunity if you're probably guilty. And then, of course, we remember Donald Trump on the campaign trail with suggestions that were likewise. However, you know, any attorney who's representing anyone, particularly in a high-level matter like this, is going to want or request immunity. Why? Because you don't want to expose your client to the pitfalls of testifying before a congressional committee, particularly when we know, Jonathan, that there are multiple investigations here in the United States concerning these matters. What matters? Whether Russia interfered with elections. What are those multiple investigations? We have a Department of Justice investigation as to whether this occurred. We have in our House of Representatives, which has 435 Congress people, right? In the House, you have an investigation by their Intelligence Committee. In the Senate, where we have 100 senators, we have a Senate Investigative Committee. And so as a practical matter and from an attorney's perspective, and as a former prosecutor, I can tell you, it's always wise to ask for immunity such that you can protect yourself from potential prosecution moving forward.
Okay, so that's why he would want it. And we've heard on this broadcast from people who are saying that the only reason that anyone would give it to him is in the context of a trade. They would have to know that he's going to offer up some kind of information that they want in order for him to get this. So let me ask you to look forward a bit. If we find out that he does get immunity, does that mean he's offered them something? Does that mean that he's got something good that the investigators want?
Well, generally speaking, Jonathan, I could tell you this, is prosecutors just don't hand out immunity like M&Ms. Generally speaking, they want what's called a proffer. What information can you provide that might be relevant and that might further the interests of the investigation, that would get to the bottom of this? Was there any type of quid pro quo between the Trump campaign and or Mr. Trump and his surrogates, between him and the Russians, to interfere with the elections? What can you tell us? So generally, you make a proffer. Would Mr. Flynn, he would be given a limited immunity for a day. It's called a Queen for a Day agreement. And in the event he had information that they thought was relevant and probative to an investigation, then he'd be given immunity. It's also important to point out as we talk about this that, again, I mentioned the multiple investigations. There's a distinction between being given immunity to testify before Congress and being given immunity from prosecution, which would not be a congressional decision. It would be a decision made by the Department of Justice. So there's a lot of moving parts here. If the Department of Justice grants him immunity from prosecution, that's blanket immunity. He could tell all he knows every day, you know, until Sunday to whatever committee. But if he's only given limited immunity by Congress, Congress does not have the power to prosecute people. That is in the province of the Department of Justice. And of course, he would still then be in a position where he could be prosecuted if only given immunity by Congress and not the Department of Justice. A lot of moving parts.
Really, it's complicated. But let me ask you this. If he does get immunity, presumably that's good for him. Presumably it's good for the investigation because it means, as you've pointed out, that he's offered the investigation something valuable. Who are the losers? I mean, does it mean that he's going to be delivering other people who are involved, other people who've had contacts with Russia that may be inappropriate? Should other people right now be nervous about what he might have to say and whether he'll be given immunity to say it?
That is a fabulous question, Jonathan, and it's the million-dollar question, because ultimately, if he tells all he knows, you know, people could be implicated or they couldn't, because we don't know all that he knows. Certainly, there is an interest in getting to the bottom of what happened here. We already know, intelligence agencies in the United States have said that Russia has interfered with the process here. Now, who, if anyone, assisted in that? Was there anyone in the United States who worked cooperatively to further that interest in interfering with the elections? That's the million-dollar question. So what Flynn knows, right, he can point to, if he can point to, whether there was such a connection between Russia and the United States, who was involved, when it occurred, when this conspiracy was hatched, if any, I think would be central to the investigation. And so we don't know, and I cannot answer your question because we don't know precisely what he knows or what he could give up in any type of testimony.
Okay, so let me ask you this. If you had a client who was also a peripheral or maybe a central figure in any of this, whether or not they had done anything wrong, would you be on the phone telling them to get immunity first before Michael Flynn gets immunity?
You know, not necessarily first, but I would certainly want them to get immunity. Remember, when we talk about the issue of immunity, it's about prosecution. And the fact is that anyone who makes statements in a public forum, a private forum, or any official type scenario where what you say can be used against you, you want to protect yourself. And so certainly any attorney who's involved in this case or who's involved with principal players or even non-principal players are going to want to tell their clients to protect themselves, because ultimately what you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. And that's significant, and it could mean jail. And I should just hasten to add this quickly, Jonathan. We had a precedent for this issue. There was a person by the name of Oliver North way back in the 1980s, and he was given immunity by Congress to testify regarding an Iran-Contra scandal and deal under President Reagan. He did testify in front of Congress with that immunity, and he was still subsequently prosecuted, convicted, and sentenced. However, one big however, that conviction was later overturned because, okay, they said that he was giving out all this information and that tainted the federal investigation, and so it made it complicated for prosecutors to distinguish between what they could use against him, hey, I'm giving immunity, in his actual testimony, and what they got independently. So ultimately here, you know what, immunity could be significant by Congress, but you always want to make sure that it's given by the Department of Justice because they're in the business of prosecuting people. Congress is not in the business of prosecuting people.
Joey Jackson, thanks very much.